Hey there guys, this is Mr. Herbst here, and today our focus is going to be on a review of energy in cells. Now first off, I want to talk about the energy within plant cells, animal cells, fungi cells, etc., so on and so forth. In cells, usable energy is in the form of this molecule called ATP that stands for adenosine triphosphate. You can sort of think of ATP as kind of like a fully charged battery, a battery that has been plugged into the wall for several hours. ATP has the formula here where you have ribose and you have adenine, and then also you have 3 of these phosphate groups. And the energy is actually stored right here in the bond between the second and the third phosphate. ATP is formed from a molecule called ADP, which stands for adenosine diphosphate. So simply put, ATP is formed when we take an extra phosphate and sort of jam it onto the end of an ADP molecule. My next focus is going to be on how do cells make ATP? Well, they make ATP from food. So all that food that you eat, all the burgers or the hot dogs, or hopefully you don't eat that bad, but all the vegetables that hopefully you eat, all of the stored energy that's in the food that you eat eventually goes to making that molecule called ATP. So switching gears for a little bit of a second here, we're talking about how do cells get food in the first place? Well, there exist 2 types of organisms on planet Earth. You either fall into 2 categories. Either you're A, a heterotroph, or B, an autotroph. Heterotrophs, well, based on this picture, you might be able to kind of infer what a heterotroph has to do. They have to eat their own food. And autotrophs, they can make their own food. Next on the list, I want to focus on how does food actually make ATP? Well, it all occurs mainly in this organelle, this little tiny part of a cell called a mitochondria. It's like a little power plant for cells. Both plants and animals have a mitochondria. If you go ahead and look over at my diagram, right, these 2 diagrams here, one's a plant, one's an animal. If you guys can see this organelle right here is called a mitochondria. And if we look over at the animal cell, this organelle right here is called a mitochondria. That is where food that we eat is converted into usable energy called ATP. And that happens because of a process called cellular respiration. Basically, it all starts with a molecule of glucose. Glucose is sugar. Sugar is food. So it all starts with sugar that you eat. And sugar is broken down into 2 molecules of pyruvic acid, and the pyruvic acid goes into another process called the Krebs cycle. So let's take a second, take a step back and review. Step 1 of cellular respiration is glycolysis. Step 2 of cellular respiration is the Krebs cycle. And then following the Krebs cycle, there is another step called the electron transport chain. So all along the steps there, step 1, step 2, and step 3, ATP molecules are produced. In glycolysis, a cell gets an average of 2 ATP. In the Krebs cycle, the cell gets an average of another 2 ATP, and the electron transport chain, that's our big guy right there. On average, 32 ATP are going to be produced in the electron transport chain. All right, so we talked a little bit about how our cells make energy from food. Where ultimately, though, does food come from? Ultimately here, guys, I know maybe not everybody is a plant eater out there. Maybe not everybody likes to eat vegetables, but overall, all of the food that you get comes from plants. Plants have this remarkable ability that they can capture sunlight and they can form their own food. Once again, they're called an autotroph. Autotrophs have the capability of producing their own food. So my next focus is going to be on, well, how do plants do that? How do plants make food? They do it through a process called photosynthesis, which actually occurs in two main phases. The first phase is what we call the light reactions, and the second phase is what we call the Calvin cycle. In the light reactions, light strikes a part of an organelle called a chloroplast. This organelle that you see here is called a chloroplast. Inside the chloroplast are many stacks of these things called thylakoids. And in part one of photosynthesis, called the light reactions, water is broken into individual atoms of water. It's broken down into hydrogen and oxygen. And in that process, a little bit of energy is released, and that energy goes to producing a little bit of ATP and a little bit of another molecule called NADPH. And as a waste, the plant gives off oxygen. That's why plants produce oxygen that we are able to breathe. But we'll get into that in a second. So after ATP and NADPH are produced, those two energy-carrying molecules go off and perform another step 2 of photosynthesis called the Calvin cycle. And in this cycle here, carbon dioxide goes in, and out comes one molecule of glucose, aka sugar. Okay, so you guys may be thinking, well, if plants can make their own food, why on earth do they need mitochondria? Once again, here's a picture of a plant cell, and I'm going to go ahead and circle the mitochondria. This thing right here is a mitochondria. This thing is right here is a mitochondria. That is the site of cellular respiration. That is where cellular respiration occurs. That's where we break down food and produce usable energy called ATP. So since plants have the ability to make their own food, why on earth do they need mitochondria? Well, let's consider what happens at nighttime. At nighttime, they do not have sunlight, so they cannot go through the light reactions. So therefore, if they want to keep on living, they better be able to break down the food that they made during the day. So therefore, they rely on mitochondria to break down the food that they made earlier in the day to produce usable energy called ATP. Next up, I want to give you guys an overview of the differences and similarities between cellular respiration and photosynthesis. Okay, so first off, guys, photosynthesis occurs only in plants, well, and algae too, but mainly just in plants. And cellular respiration, the process of breaking down food into usable energy called ATP, occurs in animals, fungi, and plants. So animals, the ones that we're most familiar with, us, we're animals, bunnies, rhinoceros, elephants, so on and so forth, all of those rely on cellular respiration only to make ATP. Plants rely on cellular respiration to make ATP, and as well as fungus. So over here, guys, is the overall reactions of both photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Now, sometimes cellular respiration is sometimes called aerobic respiration because it requires oxygen in order to happen. So here is the overall equation of photosynthesis. You start with 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, 6 molecules of water, and then energy from the sun goes into those things called chloroplasts, and out comes a molecule of glucose, which is food, and 6 oxygens. Now in cellular respiration, the opposite thing happens. In goes a molecule of glucose, which is food, and then we need oxygen in order for this equation to work. And then out comes 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, 6 molecules of water, and we get energy out of it. And that energy is in the form of ATP. Okay, so what happens in cellular respiration when there is no oxygen? So let's go ahead and review. Cellular respiration, otherwise known as aerobic respiration, requires the use of this molecule right here called oxygen. So what happens when oxygen is not present? Well, this process called fermentation happens. So if we look here at our diagram of cellular respiration, these two processes right here, the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, step 2 and step 3, both require the use of the oxygen molecule. So when oxygen is not present, the Krebs cycle cannot happen and the electron transport chain cannot happen. So overall, energy will not be produced in mitochondria, since mitochondria needs the use of an oxygen molecule in order to work. What will happen, though, is glycolysis. Glycolysis can occur whether or not oxygen is there. It doesn't really matter if oxygen is there. You're going to get ATP. Glycolysis breaks down glucose, which once again, guys, is food, into pyruvic acid, and that pyruvic acid will be broken down into another molecule if fermentation occurs. If you are an animal or a plant, when plants and animals do not have oxygen to break down their food, they go through a process called lactic acid fermentation, where following the glycolysis step 1 of cellular respiration, pyruvic acid is thus then later on converted into lactic acid. I almost can guarantee at one time in your lives you have felt lactic acid. It causes really bad muscle pains and muscle fatigue. This is why here I'm showing a picture of this guy holding his leg, because he probably worked out too hard that his muscles couldn't keep up with the demand for oxygen, and his muscles started to ferment the glucose into lactic acid. If you are an organism called yeast, which is used to make bread and beer, they produce alcohol in the process of fermentation. They do a process called alcoholic fermentation, where they give off alcohol and carbon dioxide. They do that instead of giving off lactic acid. So, looking at the two steps or two kinds of fermentation side by side, we have the first kind is lactic acid fermentation, where glucose is broken down into pyruvic acid and then later broken down into lactic acid and a little bit of ATP. Once again, that occurs in bacteria, plants, and animals. And if you have felt it before, you probably have felt it when you were exercising really hard and your muscles started to fatigue. Yeast has the ability to do what's called alcoholic fermentation, where they break down glucose into pyruvic acid, into alcohol, ATP, and carbon dioxide.